Over to Professor Tanya Harrod on craft matters. Rather similar opening image. Morning. It's a real honour to be here with such a gifted and interesting audience. Wherever we go today, it's impossible to escape from manufactured goods. We live in a world overwhelmed with machine-made objects. Many of us define ourselves through our consumption patterns. Our identities in the 21st century are to a great degree shaped by our ownership of goods. The ubiquity of new media enables our consumption to become ever more rapid, nuanced, and apparently individualized. Consumption could almost be mistaken for creativity. How are we reacting to this rapid change? Not entirely optimistically. I think it's possible to chart a resurgence of the sorrow and anxiety that has been with us since the slow, uneven development of the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century on into the early 19th century. How do we understand the present? And how do we remember what we've lost or are losing? This is an image of a huge waste dump in Lagos, Nigeria, a city that's expanding virtually without control, a city that appears to the visitor to lack order or planning, and which fails to provide the most basic public services. The traffic lights are vandalised. The storm drains on either side of the streets are blocked and filled with stagnant water. Parts of the city are under the control of area boys who rule their streets and extort money from anyone who dares venture onto their territory. The city waste dump might seem to be further evidence of the scandalous chaos of the city. But in fact, as the documentary filmmaker Gavin Searle discovered, it's a surprisingly ordered environment. The scavengers help each other out. Theft is frowned upon. Troublemakers are banned from the dump. Each scavenger is busy categorising the detritus. Some collect glass, some collect copper wire, some collect rags, and so on. In order to make a living, they have to work systematically, creating taxonomies of objects. All over the world, these dumps exist. Some cannot even be scavenged and are beyond our control. In the Pacific Ocean, there are two enormous patches of floating, mostly plastic rubbish. One's the size of Texas, brought together by the currents of the North Pacific Jar. These shocking images are evidence of our collective carelessness with the environment and with the planet. They serve to remind us that we live in a full, crowded world, bursting with objects and discarded objects, evidence of our extraordinary appetite for goods. I want to start by talking a little about artists, in a way that I hope will not appear irrelevant to this symposium, then about designers, and finally about craft, each in the context of the destructive situation in which we find ourselves. Not surprisingly, the world of consumption and the destructive traces of our limitless desire for goods have become a subject of great fascination for artists. The scavengers of the world's rubbish dumps lead lives that embody a form of creativity, albeit in extreme conditions. That artists can identify with such demanding situations is not surprising. To choose to be an artist or a craftsman is to put your life to the test again and again. It is artists, not news reporters, who provide us with some of the most striking images of the scavenger's world. There is Lucy Walker's current wonderful documentary, Wasteland, where she films the artist Vic Munez working with the rubbish pickers on a huge dump outside Rio de Janeiro. Munez seeks to find beauty in despair, and this is an image of one of the rubbish pickers posed by Munez, like the French revolutionary Jean-Paul Marat in David's famous painting. Let's move to another rubbish dump. This is a sea-jet print of a man called Samuel who lives on a waste dump near a small town called Beaufort West in South Africa. He is the central figure in a haunting series of images by the South African artist Michiel Subotsky. Samuel always wears a Spider-Man mask, and like all scavengers, he carries a metal hook. For Subotsky, taking these photographs was a way, I quote, of making sense of the very strange world I see around me. The very strange world we see around us has meant that for many artists working today, the sheer monumentality of stuff, the detritus that surrounds us, has become a subject in itself. Rubbish is transformed into large-scale monuments that aspire to a new kind of sublime. But if they are monuments, they memorialize transience and decay. Let's begin in China, where currently most things are made. Louis Genehua's Yu-Wu investigation has a bold sociological theme. Each day, 1,000 containers of goods are exported from Yiwu. These are predominantly low-cost items. Made cheaply in China, they prop up consumption in the West, but they also undercut manufacturing in Europe and North America. Yiwu investigation is an ambivalent work of art, a heaped-up monument to consumption that sets out to deny us consumption's associated pleasures and distractions. It can be paired with Monument by Claire Twomey of 2008. This has a different but equally unsettling resonance. A huge array of ceramic shards confronts us with an image of industrial waste whose scale overwhelms the gallery space. Monument was first shown at MIMA in Middlesbrough. Middlesbrough, a former industrial town now engaged on the difficult process of regeneration. The piece suggests despair, the end of manufacture, but arguably also hope. Twomey intends that this mountain of waste will go to a factory in Stoke-on-Trent to be recycled, ground into clay dust and shaped into tiles. In Britain, ceramic factories are helter-skelter, relocating production to the Far East. Monument therefore stands for a second chance, for a continuation of industrial making in Britain. Twomey's Monument appears optimistic by comparison with the French artist Christian Boltanski's Personne. Personne, with its dual meaning of people and no one, was staged in the icy January of last year in a deliberately unheated Grand Palais in Paris. Piles of old clothes were laid out on a grid. A crane plucked at a mountain of more old clothes, lifting them and dropping them apparently aimlessly. The hall was cold and noisy, reverberating with a sound of deep thuds that turned out to be recorded human heartbeats. Boltanski appeared to have in mind deportations and genocides. The owners were absent, the clothes remain. Personne was irredeemably grim, a monument to divine indifference and human transience. To visit the exhibition was a total, overwhelming experience. As Boltanski explained, he wanted the spectator to be in the artwork. Waste is also subject and object in the sculptures of the British artist Philippa Barlow. She writes, "We are competing with materialism that is on such a gigantic scale. There is a giant global industry of objects, and how does one compete with that?" Her subjects are in part a resistance to the glamorous art object. She cites disparagingly the work of Jeff Koons. She divides the worlds of art, design and craft into hot and cold objects, with hot objects engaging with materials and hand-making practices, cold ones produced by fabricators or made in multiples. She only uses cheap, discarded materials to make extraordinary, unique objects, like this sculpture made on site at the Serpentine Gallery last year. Barlow's improvisatory approach is often inspired by random relationships between objects he sees on the streets of London's East End. The streets of Rio de Janeiro are rich with her kind of inventiveness, with humble materials, but it is an inventiveness that exists outside a fine art context, and it is driven by practical requirements. The artist Gabi Gusmao has documented this everyday creativity with photographs and drawings. If Barlow uses impoverished materials deliberately, the poor of Rio have no choice. They live on what Gusmao calls Invention Street, making do as best they can. And these are just some photographs taken by Gusmao: a sound system made of a cardboard box speaker, a little resting place made of 2 broken seats, and a portable sound system on a bike with its own light shed. People who live on the streets have to adapt and appropriate. Artists can only inspire to the integrity of these improvisations. But if some artists work with detritus, rubbish, others have turned to slow handwork, to craft. Take these weeds made by the Japanese artist Yoshihiro Suda. He carves small plants out of magnolia wood and paints them realistically. Placed in art galleries and museums, Suda's weeds are so small that they are easily overlooked, apparently growing out of cracks in stonework or plaster. His installations aim to make visitors aware of the gallery space, for at first sight, the gallery looks completely empty. His emphasis on skill, his absence of an individual expressive style, and his use of traditional tools and materials make him into a neo-folk artist who has deliberately chosen a slow way of working. The German polymath, Walter Benjamin, wrote vividly of changes brought about by industrialisation. Small workshops and homes where potters, weavers and spinners worked were, he argued, not only places where things were made, stories were also told there at a human pace and rhythm. The linkage of storytelling and crafts between life and work was disrupted by industrialisation. But Benjamin did not live to see our post-industrial world, which in Europe has eroded even the comradeship of the factory, replacing it with truly solitary work in a call centre or in a back room inputting data. A turn to slow design, slow cooking, slow crafts suggests current anxieties and a dissatisfaction with the hyper-reality of the present and the ways in which we work. Loss is something that has been confronted all over the world. In China, the artist Liang Shaoji documents traditional architecture and its destruction. Here he records beams from a demolished building. But if traditional architecture is undervalued in favour of rapid development and industrialisation in China, in Britain, paradoxically, we are losing our industrial base. The ceramicist Neil Bransford trained as an apprentice in the Wedgwood factory before going to art college. By the late 1990s, seeing factories like this being pulled down as the ceramics industry moved to the Far East, Bransford began to interview and film the last of the highly skilled members of the Wedgwood workforce. This is a still from Neil's film showing a craftsman working on relief figures applied to Wedgwood jasperware. His own extraordinary salvage series is an installation made up of hundreds of items that record the discarded detritus that are byproducts of the industrial production of ceramics. Drip trays and trivets, props and spurs used to support objects in the kiln, tangled strips of clay left after turning, collapsed and fused saggers, the ghostly residues left by the process of plaster lining damaged moulds. There has also been a turn to slowness amongst designers that seeks both to reform work processes and the ways in which we consume. Some designers wish to restore memory and reflection to our consumption. For example, the Dutch designer Simon Huygens' project Broken White creates ceramic dishes that over time develop tiny cracks that reflect the use of plates and cups by the owner. To build in artistic deterioration is an extraordinary reaction to the perfection of the manufactured world. But in a crowded world of goods, it is designers who have to face the serious problem of making yet another product. No wonder some young designers think of starting from scratch. Starting from scratch, beginning with zero, a tabula rasa, the Robinson Crusoe syndrome. These are all phrases that suggest a new dynamic. At the Royal College of Art, where I occasionally teach, design product students are currently strikingly drawn to old materials like bamboo or rubber, and to archaic techniques. The idea of beginning again, and maybe failing, recalls Robinson Crusoe's boat in the novel by Daniel Defoe. Alone at that point on his island, Crusoe painstakingly hollowed out a canoe out of a great trunk of wood, taking 3 months over the task. But the boat turned out to be too heavy to drag down to the sea. It was made, Crusoe concluded philosophically, to teach me to be wiser next time. At a moment of perceived ecological crisis, many of us seek to be wiser next time. Take, for example, Thomas Thwaites' toaster project, presented at the Royal College degree show last summer. Thwaites whimsically attempted to make an electric toaster starting from scratch, travelling to disused mines in Britain, attempting to dig up raw materials, attempting to process them, and to make a handcraft version of a mass-produced object sold for the throwaway price of a few pounds. He tried to mine, melt, and purify copper, iron ore, nickel, mica, and to make plastic. The project was as much as anything a symbolic commentary on consumption, on industrial decline, there are virtually no active mines in the UK, and on the ridiculousness of toasters as discrete objects performing a rather limited task. And here we see his attempt to extract iron ore using a chimney and hairdryers. Here he's grappling with the plastic casing of his toaster, and here the finished product. Its casing, inner workings and plug. The results are funny, annoying and heartbreaking. These attempts to go back to basics in the face of industrial crisis are also examined in the symbolic projects dreamt up by the young Italian designers Andrea Trimacci and Simone Farazzi, based at Eindhoven, who work under the name Forma Phantasma. Under the rubric autarky, they dream of self-sufficient communities which fulfill all needs using local materials, making vessels like these, for instance, out of flour, agricultural waste and natural limestone, or in this instance, vessels made using blocks of pine carved to make moulds, with the resulting waste again mixed with lime, flour and water, and lacquered with pine resin and beeswax. The despair we might feel about worthwhile work is a distinct theme in contemporary design, tackled with particular wit by the designer Thomas Gabriel Libertini. This is his honeycomb vase, made for the Dutch design group Droog. Libertini sees this vase as an example of slow prototyping. It's not made by hand, nor by machines. It is made by bees, 40,000 bees at work for a week. This is in many ways an absurd object that made people smile. But did it make them think? Perhaps Libertini had in mind Karl Marx's famous passage in Das Kapital on the architect and the bee. Marx wrote, "A spider conducts operations that resemble those of a weaver, and a bee puts to shame many an architect in the construction of her cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is this, that the architect raises his structure in imagination before he erects it in reality." Marx was talking about the sanctity of work and the distinctness of human labour. We are not bees. We need to remember we are craftsmen and women, designers and artists, gifted with imagination and foresight. In a full world, that means making anything at all is a responsibility. A concern with loss and the way in which we produce and consume can take many forms. One important concern is central to our gathering today. How do we conserve and keep alive skills and crafts that are of huge value, but which lack obvious economic fit? Rather like plants with a possible medical application in threatened rainforests, many craft skills may seem irrelevant to a fully wired post-industrial Britain. But we will mourn their loss practically and functionally for sure, and also for our sense of locality and personhood, psychically, as it were. The artists Jeremy Deller and Alan Kane have sought to record customs and crafts as markers of a sense of locality and of individual agency in their folk archive. Some of the images and objects testify to everyday creativity, like this customised motorbike helmet by Sam Hughes. Other objects and photographs document the survival of ancient customs, like the annual Welsh ceremony, in which a singer goes from pub to pub wearing a horse's skull to mark the shortest day of the year, this image here on the right. Della also documents the materiality of things like public protest, like this mock tank photographed on the 2002 Stop the War March. Anxiety about the present can take different forms, and the associated sense of loss has a long history. Ideas about what constituted traditional craft have shifted and changed. For example, the arts and crafts movement was a design reform movement that sought to expand our ideas of art beyond painting and sculpture. This is a silver muffin dish designed by C.R. Ashby in 1900. It's in this museum and was made in the East End by Ashby's Guild of Handicraft as part of a project to engage working class men and boys in fulfilling work. A design like this was a reaction to a loss of skills and sensitivity in the world of goods. It was a political response to ideas about joy, labour, and about conditions of labour. But when we read, say, William Morris, we hear surprisingly little about vernacular and rural skills, like reel writing, basketry, spoon and bowl turning, quarrying, coppice work, and the production of utilitarian earthenware. Morris's textiles and wallpapers and stained glass were highly complex and designed for a luxury market. This is Cray of 1884, a textile that required 34 separate blocks to print. One of the only vernacular, rurally inspired designs by Morris and Company was the Sussex chair range produced from 1866. It was based on a traditional type of rush-seated chair, but the vernacular original may in turn have derived from a Regency chair. Its origins, therefore, may have been polite rather than rustic. The vernacular heritage is, as we shall see, always hard to define and pin down. Each generation seeks the vernacular they need. Morris looked out of England for inspiration, to India, to the Middle East, to Iceland, to Norway. This is a double-handled Norwegian drinking cup of 1739. A generation or so after Morris, others clearly believed that traditional craft was over in Britain. The collection of peasant art, now at Hazelmere Museum in Surrey, formed in the late 19th century, from which this Norwegian drinking cup comes, drew mainly on Northern and Eastern Europe. It comprises work collected that was made for love, not money, work made for a peasant's use and not for sale. Such elaborate, homemade folk objects were not much to be found in England, partly because we did not have a peasantry in the continental sense. As Karl Marx had already noted in Capital, with England in mind, the destruction of rural domestic industry is necessary to give the internal market of a country that extension and consistency which the capitalist mode of production requires. Nonetheless, the arts and crafts movement, as it spread all over Europe and North America, led to a greater respect for vernacular craft, particularly in countries that sought a national identity, Norway at the end of the 19th century, for instance. Thus, although our drinking cup dates from the 18th century, such objects were much copied and fed into 19th century romantic nationalism and burgeoning tourism in Norway. Crisis and rapid change can spark off an urgent interest in older ways of working. This may explain the lively interest both in craft and in what was called popular art in Britain in the 1930s and on into the Second World War. During the interwar period, a period of partial economic and social stasis and decline, there were various modern responses to traditional craft. The term popular art, for instance, described an industrial vernacular as opposed to rural crafts, the art of fairgrounds, pub signs, gypsy caravans and Staffordshire flatbacks. Popular art's main chronicler, the textile designer Enid Marks, noted popular art's forthrightness, gaiety, delight in bright colours, and a sense of well-balanced design. This page from her English Popular and Traditional Art of 1946 suggests what she meant by popular art, which she termed hard to define, though easy to recognise when seen. It is not non-industrial, rather it is and was an industrial vernacular. But reflecting on the present, and her second study, written with Margaret Lambert, appeared in 1951, Marx saw the disappearance of what she called the innocent eye. She meant a loss of individuality, a lack of initiative, a worrying passivity amongst consumers. The interwar writings of Dorothy Hartley are rather different, and much more concerned with non-industrial, often rural craft processes. Her detailed researches in the 30s for her classic Made in England threw up an enormous amount of skilled insular handwork. Hartley grouped crafts under materials, wood, straw, reed, and so on. And here are her exquisite drawings for ling or heather broom making. She wanted to record something that had been, the Rural Industries Bureau notwithstanding, unknown and neglected by government, but which were, I quote, of the utmost value to England. She feared the disappearance of workers who fought for themselves and their replacement by what she called well-drilled, obedient masses. Made in England went into several editions, and for the 1973 National Trust reprint, Hartley wrote a preface that was fairly despairing. Some of the chroniclers of craft between the wars harboured extraordinary hopes. The country writer H.J. Massingham believed our future is in our past, our pre-industrial past, and he collected old tools in the hope that they would, I quote, be a service to posterity should England again recolonise with small farming communities. These tools were drawn by the artist Thomas Hennell for Massingham's compendious Country Relics of 1939. Tools spoke to Massingham. He was moved to tears by this seedlip for broadcasting seed as he brooded wistfully on an unenclosed England that knew nothing of the diabolical philosophy of Hobbes nor of the horrors of industrialisation. This seedlip was part of Massingham's large collection of tools, all now in the Museum of Rural Life at Reading, still waiting. Massingham's was a political response to declining craft. His dream of repopulating the countryside and reintroducing a craft economy was linked into a horror of banking and paper money, of cities and of trades unions. He belonged in the troubled 30s to a far-right green organic farming tendency. But the survival of craft could mean many things, and during the Second World War, an older pre-industrial England was invoked to win hearts and minds in the United States through the exhibition Modern British Craft, which was sent by the British Council to tour the USA during 1942 until 1945. This is the country dining room setting, with a mix of studio pottery and country pottery and Edward Gardner chairs and textiles by Barron and Larcher. And here, a young American boy holding C.J. Shiner's Dunkirk cup and a traditional rake. Why send craft to the USA during the war? The idea was to present an image of an organic community as the very opposite of what Churchill described as mechanised barbarians. That was how Churchill described the enemy we were fighting, and until early 1942, Britain was fighting alone. The theme of individualism and ownership of tools as of creating improved persons, often in the face of a manifest loss of freedom and individuality of mechanised barbarians, has remained a constant in thought about the crafts. The USA publication, The Whole Earth Catalogue, with its subtitle Access to Tools, swept America and Europe from 1968, offering a lifestyle independent of the technocracy, to use a popular term at the time. The Whole Earth Catalogue was to serve as a counterculture of geodesic domes, home berths, communes, looms, axes and potter's wheels. And this is just one little detail of one of the many editions of the Whole Earth Catalogue, showing tools and the chair that you can assemble. Not really true craft, in fact, but an extraordinary mixture of catalogues, books, Meanwhile, in England, Lord Eccles, the Tory politician who brought the Crafts Council into being, was writing of science and technology as two unstoppable giants who were turning half the world into one well-stocked, packaged, heavily advertised supermarket. But let's end with the present, the here and now. Today in Britain, surviving traditional ways of working are being urgently reinvestigated all over again. The nostalgic television series Masterclass signed up eager volunteers to learn the rudiments of traditional skills like thatching, green woodworking and blacksmithing. The participants all presumably hoped that they might thereby abandon unfulfilling day jobs. The Guardian newspaper has been featuring a series entitled Disappearing Acts, in which John Ronson has documented skills and crafts that are in danger of vanishing. Our chairman, Robin Wood, pole lathe turning, wheelwrighting, Geoffrey Preston, decorative plasterer, and Adam King, broom maker. Craft has become part of the political rhetoric of our coalition government. Matthew Crawford's neoliberal book, The Case for Working with Your Hands, or Why Office Work is Bad for Us and Fixing Things Feels Good, has been a bestseller both here and in the United States. As in the 30s, we face economic crisis and uncertainty. Now, as I suggested, we also have something more startling to consider, the virtual disappearance of manufacturing from these areas. I think this explains why makers, in particular potters, are going over to China to work in factories. The high skill and frenzied activity of Chinese factories recalls our past. In a sense, we are going back to the 19th century by travelling to the distant present. There's a lot of handwork in such places, as there was in Victorian factories. And here we see artisans at Mr. Wu's bigware factory in Jingdezhen luting together thrown sections of a large pot for the British ceramicist Felicity Alive. And here is one of her finished pieces. There's something paradoxical about this. Studio pottery at the beginning of the last century was defined against the factory. Now, these Chinese factories seem full of marvels, as exciting and as challenging as the studio, exotic places for the service industry nation we have become. The Heritage Craft Association, which we are gathered here to celebrate, is keenly aware that not only are we losing traditional rural craft skills, but also the skills within manufacturing. In particular, industrial skills are part of our heritage, though they were little appreciated by the arts and crafts movement and by the 20th century craft movement. But now we are beginning to feel quite differently about factories. So what exactly is heritage craft? I can do no better than to quote Enid Marx rather than Karl Marx, though I think they were in fact distantly related. It's hard to define, though easy to recognise when seen. Here's the late Ernie James, the last but one eel trapper and maker of eel traps in East Anglia, photographed on his punt, going about his business in the 1960s. An image from the magnificent show at the Sainsbury Centre at the University of East Anglia, Basketry, Making Human Nature. Each age, under the condition of modernity, will define terms like heritage, vernacular or craft differently. But what does not change is the pain, longing and unease associated with their loss. Thank you.